Welcome everybody to our last day. So the first presentation today is by Marina Banchetti-Robino. So, hi Marina, would you like to share yours?
Yes. Can everybody see everything?
Yeah. Everything okay? All yours.
Okay. Excellent.
We can close our microphones, please.
Okay. So I will be speaking today, and I'm very happy to be here, by the way. I will be speaking today about something of a historical nature, talking about Robert Boyle on the relational and dispositional nature of chemical properties. This is a talk I would have given last summer if we had met, so I decided to just do the same this year. And this is, okay, so I'm trying to advance my slide here. Okay, there we go. So this is Robert Boyle, very handsome with his wig, as we were talking about earlier, 1627 to 1691. Robert Boyle's view on chemical qualities has been the subject of some debate with historians and philosophers of chemistry over the last 2 decades. And I want to begin, before I start talking about that, about his conception of mechanistic properties, because the whole debate has been over whether Robert Boyle considers chemical qualities to be reducible to the primary mechanistic properties of fundamental corpuscles or to the primary mechanistic qualities of microstructure. So essentially, there are 2 sets of primary qualities for Boyle. We have the mechanistic inherent non-relational properties of fundamental particles, which are shape, size, and motion or rest. And then we also have the primary mechanistic inherent and non-relational properties of what William Newman has referred to as chemical atoms. Now, chemical atoms are a term that Newman uses to refer to what Boyle called corpuscular concretions. The reason that Newman chose the term atoms is because for Boyle, these corpuscular concretions, which are what we might call today molecules, are not really reducible to fundamental particles through ordinary chemical procedures. And the mechanistic property of these chemical atoms is their microstructure, or what Boyle called their texture or essential form. So as I mentioned, the debate over the last several decades has been over whether Boyle considers chemical qualities to be deducible from and reducible to, in a kind of strictly sort of simplistic reduction to the primary qualities. Now, there's now general agreement that he does not consider chemical qualities to be reducible to the primary mechanistic qualities of fundamental particles. However, some scholars still want to argue that he considers the chemical qualities as reducible to the microstructure of chemical atoms or to their texture. So what I want to argue today, and what I also argue extensively in my book, is that he does not consider chemical qualities to be reducible in a simplistic sort of way to the microstructure, and that instead he considers them to be relational and dispositional properties that supervene upon the microstructure of chemical atoms. I also want to argue that he considers them to be affordances, in the same sense, actually, meant by Ram Hare. So I'm going to be showing you a few citations from Boyle, but because they're extensive, for the sake of time, I'm only going to be focusing on the sections that I've highlighted in red. So in The Origin of Forms and Qualities, he says, I do not see why we may not conceive that as to those qualities which we call sensible, which includes chemical qualities, they are not in the bodies that are endowed with them any real or distinct entities or differing from the matter itself. In other words, what he's saying here is that the qualities do not differ from the matter itself. In the next citation, These attributes, when he talks about the solubility of gold in aqua regia and the insolubility of gold in aqua fortis, he wants to say that these attributes, solubility, insolubility, are not in the gold anything distinct from its particular texture or its peculiar texture. And so these kinds of claims by Boyle have been the subject of this controversy. How do we interpret them? Do we interpret them reductionistically? And if we do so, then this would collapse the distinction between the qualities and the microstructure or texture. In other words, they are one and the same. Or we can interpret these in a non-reductionist fashion, which is what I'm advocating. And I would argue that when Boyle says that the qualities are nothing different from the matter itself, what he's really doing is he's saying that they are not properties of a distinct and immaterial substantial form, because this is really what he was arguing against. He was arguing against the scholastic notion of substantial form. Nevertheless, I will also argue that he considers them to be novel, dispositional, and relational properties that emerge from the microstructure. Now, let me first address the implications of the reductionist interpretation, which is what I'm arguing against. To identify the chemical properties of bodies or substances with their primary qualities is really to collapse the distinction between what an object will do and what an object is in itself. When one collapses this distinction between the substance or its inner structure and the chemical qualities of that substance, then one is treating the chemical qualities as being absolute properties that are inherent in the microstructure. So let's take the example from the citation earlier, in which Boyle talks about the solubility of gold in aqua regia, which is a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acids, and the insolubility of gold in aqua fortis, which is nitric acid. If one collapses the distinction between the microstructure or the texture, as he says, and the solubility, then one is treating this property as inherent and absolute. And the following consequence would ensue from this. So if we say solubility, S, is inherent and not distinct from texture T of gold, that would be S equals T. And then if we say that, so that would be the insolubility is tilde S, right? So he says gold is soluble in aqua regia, not soluble in aqua fortis. So we've got S equals T. But then we also have insolubility, which is tilde S or not S, as being inherent and not distinct from texture of gold. So, and that should be S equals not T, by the way. So we end up with this kind of absurd conclusion that the texture of gold is both equal to S and to not S. I mean, if we treat these properties as being absolute and inherent, that's the absurd conclusion that would follow. It is unlikely that Boyle would endorse this absurd conclusion that the texture of gold is inherently both soluble and insoluble as such. And to avoid that conclusion, we must introduce relationality. That is, the chemical property must be treated as relational rather than as inherent and absolute. So new relations then would lead substances to acquire novel properties. Once relationality is introduced, the contradiction is avoided thus. The disposition of gold to be soluble in relation to aqua regia, so S sub AR, is not distinct from texture T. The disposition of gold to be insoluble in relation to aqua fortis, tilde or not S sub AF, is not distinct from texture T. You can see that the contradiction that we had earlier is avoided because S sub AR is a distinct relational property from tilde S sub AF. So the question is, does Boyle in fact do this? In other words, does he in fact treat solubility and other chemical properties as relational and dispositional? Now here's a quote from the Producibleness of Chemical Principles from 1680. So, quite a bit of time after the earlier citation. in this citation, he says, solubility is in fact a disposition. It's a disposition to be dissoluble in this or that liquor that may be acquired by mixture and the new texture of parts. So clearly then, for Boyle, the chemical property is in fact a dispositional property. It is also not an inherent property of the microstructure, but a novel property that emerges when gold enters into relation with aqua regia. He talks about that as being an acquired property. I'm using contemporary language here, but essentially this is what he's saying. So when he says it may be acquired by the mixture, he's also then saying that the chemical property is in some ways relational. And we can describe it in this way. So I have the citation there on the left side, okay? We have substance 1, which is the agent. So for example, in this case, aqua regia, that has the disposition to affect, due to its own microstructure, the second substance, which is the patient, in this example, gold. Gold, because of its structure, microstructure, has the disposition to be affected by the aqua regia. When these two substances are mixed, a new texture or microstructure is produced, thereby leading to the emergence of a novel chemical quality, in this case, solubility. Now, Ram Hare, in his article in Hele from 2014, introduced the concept of affordance into contemporary philosophy of chemistry to describe the dispositional and relational character of chemical properties. And here's the citation from Ram. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read it, but he does talk about affordances as attributes not of an independent world revealed by the use of an apparatus, but as dispositional properties of a hybrid entity. Interestingly, there is clear textual evidence that Boyle also regarded chemical properties as affordances in Hare's sense of the term. And here's a citation here from the Skeptical Chemist in 1661, in which he does talk about some concretes affording more of them than others do. Nay, and sometimes this or that body affording a greater number of differing substances by one way of management than the same yields by another. Way of management is essentially here the experimental procedures being used, right? Which is what Ram is talking about here as the hybrid entity of an indissoluble union of apparatus, experimental, and world. This is what Boyle here means by management, what we do to these substances. Here's another citation in which he talks about silver affording some grains of very pure gold based on a certain kind of chemical procedure. Another citation here where he uses the term affordance. Once again, I'm not reading all of these because I don't want to run out of time. So on the basis of these arguments then, it can also be concluded that Boyle regards chemical properties as emergent properties that supervene upon the microstructure of chemical atoms. Now, Boyle did not employ the contemporary vocabulary of emergence, but we can use this vocabulary to demonstrate, to show that Boyle's conception of chemical qualities would conform to how we speak today about emergent properties. So when we look at this two citations from The Origin of Form and Qualities, we see that Boyle here says, there are some bodies not cathartic, not sudorific, with which some of which gold being joined acquires a purgative virtue, and with others a power to procure sweat. Next citation, nature herself doth produce so many things that have new relations unto others. And art, in this case, chemical practice, and as he says here, especially assisted by chemistry, may by variously dissipating natural bodies and so on and so forth, make such an innumerable company of new productions that will each of them have new operations either immediately upon our sensories or upon other bodies, whose changes we are able to perceive. Now, if we go back to the theory of emergent properties, there are several characteristics that we can attribute to emergent properties. And I've isolated 3 of the important ones that I want to focus on for this talk. First of all, emergent properties are regarded as being supervenient. By this, we mean that changes to the emergent properties depend upon changes to the submergent base. And in fact, Boyle does believe, and he does regard, changes in chemical properties as being dependent upon changes to the texture. So when a new texture is produced, new qualities emerge. But clearly, even though he's not using our contemporary language, we would say that this is a feature of supervenience. Secondly, emergent properties are regarded as novel properties. In other words, the component parts of a substance do not display the higher level properties. And again, Boyle would agree with this. The supervenient properties cannot be additively derived from the subvenient base. In other words, from the microstructure of gold, to go back to the example we used, we cannot simply derive the idea that gold will be soluble in aqua regia, but not soluble in aqua fortis. And he does sustain this view then that chemical properties are not displayed by the lower level parts of substances. Finally, emergent properties are also regarded as being causally efficacious. They are not simply epiphenomena, right? An epiphenomenon is something that can be perceived but has no causal power in the world. So for example, the shadow on a wall of a person is an epiphenomenon in the sense that the shadow has no causal power on the world whatsoever. However, emergent properties are not merely epiphenomenal. They are causally efficacious properties. And we know Boyle, of course, agrees with this because there would be no science of chemistry if chemical properties had no causal power. So these are 3 very important features of what we would call emergent properties that Boyle clearly believes pertain to chemical properties: supervenience, novelty, and of course, causal efficaciousness. I see that in my desire not to run out of time, I've actually sort of anticipated myself, and this is the end of my presentation, but I'd be very happy to discuss more about this and perhaps even go back to some of those citations if you want to see them during the Q&A. So I will say gracias a todos. Thank you to everyone, and also to my aunts in Italy who are viewing this presentation. We can, I guess, finish here and have a bit of discussion at this point. Thank you.
Congrats for your amazing talk, Marina. So anyone that has a question, please post a Q in the chat. We have something like 12 minutes for questions and answers. So the first question is from Farsad.
Thank you. Hey, Marina, that was wonderful. Thanks for a really enjoyable, enlightening presentation about Boyle. I really like the emergent quality thing. I think that really covers the basis. That S tilde S explanation was really great as well. I just have a question from the beginning regarding chemical atoms.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit more and tell us what Boyle is doing with that again?
I can go back to that first slide if you wish.
Sure.
Okay, so for the sake of time, I didn't do the whole distinction between primary, secondary qualities and Boyle. I just focused on primary qualities here. Chemical atoms is not a term used by Boyle himself. It's a term used by the historian of chemistry, Boyle scholar William Newman, to refer to what Boyle calls corpuscular concretions. So for him, fundamental particles, fundamental corpuscles are what he would call minima naturalia, right? They are the smallest possible entities in nature. Those have the properties of shape, size, and motion or rest, okay? But he also believes that these particles come together in what he calls these corpuscular concretions that essentially have a texture, that's the term he uses, or essential form, again, that's the term he uses, that is so tightly close together. He doesn't believe in bonding forces or anything like that. He believes that the particles are so closely together that they form this sort of microstructure that cannot be further reduced by ordinary chemical analytical procedures. He does believe that the alkahest, he does believe in the possibility of transmutation. He is interested in alchemy, and he does believe that the alkahest might be able to break down these microstructure, but ordinary, chemical procedures, ordinary analytical agents like aqua regia, aqua fortis, or even fire are not capable of breaking down that microstructure. And so this is why Newman chooses the term chemical atoms, because even though they're not ontologically atomic as such, they can be considered that as elementary, right? So you have this notion of kind of operational elementarity already in Boyle. I don't know if that's answered your question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I guess I'm thinking then for him, the chemical atoms would be, or the corpuscular concretions, does that correspond to what we would call element? Did he use the term element or not in that way?
I guess it would correspond to what Pierre Gassendi and also we today would call molecules, okay? But they have a certain kind of, I would say, a certain kind of operational elementarity. The concept of a chemical atom or corpuscular concretion would be, as Bernadette Danseau-Vincent had said, it's kind of a negative empirical concept, right? Because it is defined negatively in terms of what we cannot do to this thing, which is we cannot break it down further by ordinary chemical means, or at least by the chemical means that were available, analytic means that were available to him during his time, which would be these corrosive acids or fire.
Okay, and quickly, I want to get out of the way, but the fundamental particles, those are not observable according to Boyle, right?
Correct.
But he still posits. Okay.
Yeah, he posits them. In other words, he's not an atomist in the sense that he's more of a corpuscularian, very much like Descartes, because he doesn't want to hypothesize that these particles cannot be broken down by God, for example, but they certainly cannot be broken down by natural means, right? So he doesn't want to commit to a strictly atomistic view, but he certainly wants to commit to a corpuscularian view that these are the most fundamental particles in nature. They are unobservable, as are also the chemical atoms, right? Because these would be like what we call molecules. And he also believes that there's a whole hierarchy, right? So you've got the primary concretions, then you've got the molecules themselves coming together and forming secondary concretions at a higher level, and more degrees of complexity. I've restricted myself to this for the sake of time, but he does have a very sort of more complex view of this hierarchy.
Well, that's great. Look forward to reading your book more. Thank you. Awesome.
Sure.
Thank you, Farsar. So next question is from Jesus.
Thank you for the interesting talk, Marina. My question is, I don't understand very well why in the reductionist approach there is a collapsing of what the system is in itself and what it will do.
So this is, yes.
Yeah, tell me.
This is how a lot of the reductionist interpretations have read what Boyle is saying here when he says, let me see, they are not, okay, so let me just collapse this image. So they are not in the bodies that are endowed with them any real or distinct entities or differing from the matter itself. These attributes are not in the gold anything distinct from its peculiar structure. So essentially, that's what a lot of the interpreters who favor sort of reductionist reading have concluded, that essentially the properties are inherent to the texture. You see what I'm saying? They're not emergent properties. So this is why then the property then becomes collapsed, where what something does, in other words, its properties to affect something else or to be affected, are essentially one and the same with its microstructure. In other words, what the thing is in terms of its inner nature, right? So that's how the reductionists have read those passages. And so I'm arguing against that reading.
But for example, the dispositional properties are in virtue of the microstructure of the system, right?
Yes.
But there is a kind of necessary connection between the dispositions and the inner structure of the system.
Yes, and that connection is what contemporary emergence theory calls supervenience. In other words, changes in the properties depend upon changes in the structure, right? In the microstructure. So there is a connection, right? In other words, the properties emerge from the texture, and any change to the texture will lead to a change in the properties that emerge from it. So there is that relation of dependence, absolutely. But at the same time, though, the property is not an absolute or inherent property because it will only emerge under certain kinds of conditions, right? So the microstructure is disposed to produce this property, but only under certain kinds of relationships to other things.
Okay, but how do you attribute some particular disposition to a particular object, individual object?
Well, I mean, I guess through experimental procedures, right? So, for example, gold is disposed to dissolve in aqua regia, but not in aqua fortis. So, how do we attribute this? Well, we conduct these experiments, and we see that, in fact, when we create a relation between gold and one kind of acidic substance, it dissolves. And when we create a relation between gold and a different acidic substance, it doesn't dissolve. And so these are experimental conclusions that Boyle is reaching, right? He's an experimental scientist. And so that's how we make those attributions, right? Now, obviously, because he believes that there is this texture, he would attribute those dispositions to some change in the texture. In other words, when the microstructure of gold comes in relation to the microstructure of aqua regia, and a mixed substance is created, a new texture emerges that produces this, chemical properties. When the microstructure of gold comes together with the microstructure of aqua fortis, a different kind of structure is produced that does not, cause the dissolution of gold. So. Okay. Do you see what I'm saying? Or rather, let me explain it differently. The microstructure of aqua fortis is not capable of engendering a change in gold that will make it dissolve.
Okay.
As opposed to, yes.
Thank you.
And again, I'm explaining this and using his kind of sort of theoretical paradigm rather than in contemporary terms, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes and 2 more questions. The first one from Jute and next from Klaus, if we have time.
Very, very quickly. How do you combine the fact that emergent properties are causally efficacious, as you said, with your reductionist view on primary qualities?
No, I'm actually arguing against the reductionist view.
I know. With the anti-reductionist view.
Oh, okay.
I think it really would, the causally efficaciousness would lead to a reductionist view, logically.
No, on the contrary, emergentism, which is primarily a theory that has come out of the philosophy of mind, in terms of, is anti-reductionist, because what emergentism wants to argue is that although these causal properties are dependent upon the subvenient base, they acquire what can be they acquire a life of their own, so to speak. They have ontological status and they have causal power. If for the reductionist, you know, these properties will be more like a reductionist would not be able to attribute causal power to anything other than the Sabinian base, right? That was also, in some sense, the Cartesian position, because Descartes, in some sense, was much more of a reductionist than Boyle. Even though Boyle has been taken to be one of the great representatives of the mechanistic view, he does not have a mechanistic conception of chemical qualities, right? He considers them to be different kinds of properties from the properties of the primary particles, or even of the structure, of the microstructure. For a reductionist, you know, nothing other than the mechanical properties would have causal power. So this is what so this is why the emergence view actually is anti-reductionist.
But it is also not causal deterministic. But I don't want to go on with the discussion, because I have a different view on causality, and
Okay.
but we have no time now to discuss that.
Okay, well, sorry, Klaus, but we are run out of time. Maybe you can keep talking on the coffee break. Well, thank you, Marina, for your talk.
You're welcome.